Let's introduce ourselves. My name is John McDonnell. I'm the Labour MP for Hayes and Harlington and formerly was the Shadow Chancellor for the Labour Party. With me is Andrew Fisher, who was the head of the policy for the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn and is famed for being the drafter of the last two Labour manifestos. Andrew and I have looked at what's going to face an incoming Labour government. Now that we've had a number of polls and a by-election in Scotland, which was truly seismic in terms of its result, we're increasingly confident now that we'll have a Labour government. And the key issue now is what will face that Labour government once it's elected. So we're publishing a report which is about Labour's in-tray, and it just sets out some of the issues a Labour government will have to confront, particularly as a result of all these years of austerity and the policies that the Tories have pursued over the last 14 years, which have undermined our public services, frozen people's wages, and created a level of poverty in this country we haven't seen for generations. These are real challenges that Labour will face going to government. And of course, people are concerned about the onrushing climate crisis that we're facing as well. We've looked at policy area by policy area, and we've tried to identify what's happened to our society since 2010 under the Tories, and what that means by way of some of the policy changes that Labour will have to consider, and then looked at the costings of those policy changes to try and get a feel for the scale of the problems that Labour will face, but also the scale of the resources that it needs as well. Andrew, just explain your view on that issue, the scale of the challenge that Labour will face, and then we'll have a look at some of the individual policy areas that we have to address.
Thanks, John. I think people can see all around them the crisis that exists in our public services. You see it with the record waiting lists on the NHS, the amount of people that can't get social care, that are waiting for mental health treatment, right down to the capital investment in our schools, the crumbling concrete issues, as well as oversized classes and the failure to recruit teachers on anywhere near the scale needed, just on the government's own targets. And then, of course, you've got the capital investment side, which feeds into our failure on climate. The climate committee this year saying the government's not on track anymore, the housing crisis, the failure on transport infrastructure, which has really been exposed again at Conservative Party conference this past week. So on a whole range of issues, people can see it, as well as their local councils collapsing increasingly around the country and the services being cut. So people can see the scale of what the problems are. And what we've looked at in this is not recreating the 2019 manifesto, but just looking at what it would cost to stabilise and to deliver the sort of improvements that would take us back to where we were in 2010. So a very modest look at what that would require in terms of public spending and public investment that Labour's really got to start making the case for if we're actually going to turn things around in government.
Let's look at some of the detail. Let's drill down in some of the detail of that on individual policy areas in particular. Let's start with health. In the report, we've identified that the long-term average investment each year was around about 4%. What we've seen under the Tories is that drop to 1%. So hence the consequences in terms of the crisis in the NHS. We can't call it anything else. It's a crisis within the NHS, both in terms of staffing and waiting lists. Just take us through some of the costings about what Labour will need to invest just to get us back on track with regard to that level of investment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, both parties actually have signed up to what the NHS workforce plan in recent months. That is estimated to cost an extra 3.6% of investment per year in the NHS just to deliver the workforce alone. So if we go back to the historical average of 4%, that doesn't leave you a lot in terms of extra investment in NHS capacity as well, but that would mean an extra 10 billion spent on the NHS by the end of the Parliament. If you go back to the sort of increases that were delivered under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, where it was near 6%, then actually you're looking at closer to 15 billion. So that's quite a big scale. And when you look at what Labour has promised so far in terms of investment and what it's ruled out in terms of tax rises, they've not left themselves much wiggle room. And that's just on health. That's before you get to social care, schools, the courts, and all the other things that are collapsing. So really, I think we need to be looking at a lot more, much more ambitious. And Labour is going to have to look at a much more ambitious funding programme in order to meet the need. We have got record waiting lists. I mean, we used to talk about an NHS winter crisis. The NHS is in perma crisis at the moment under the Conservatives, and there's no alternative, no amount of reform, and there is some reform needed, but there's no alternative to much bigger investment as well.
One of the areas that we've been arguing for greater investment within health overall, and thank goodness people are recognizing this now, is around mental health and the way in which investment in mental health services and support actually can transform people's lives. Take us through some of the numbers involved in that. If we're going to have some real effect when we go into government.
Yeah, I mean, the mental health crisis is particularly acute amongst young people, but it's actually across all age groups. The amount of demand on mental health services has gone up tremendously. The government has put in a little bit more resource. So if we look at one figure, or one way of looking at this is the amount of doctors dedicated in CAMS, child and adolescent mental health services. That's gone up 16% in the last few years. But demand has gone up by over 300%. So, for example, the BMA has looked at this in quite a lot of detail, the British Medical Association. They say that annual funding's gone up by £2.3 billion. They reckon to meet need, just to stabilise where we are today, would take an extra 5.2 billion. So you can see already there's a need for an extra 2.9 billion to be invested into mental health services just to meet the current levels of need. That's not for any great expansion of any services that currently aren't offered. That's just to meet the need that's there. So it's a real crisis in the mental health services. And anyone who's had a relative, a friend, a neighbour who's been waiting for mental health support knows how bad that is as well at the moment.
Any constituency MP as well will explain, although, yes, we welcome the extra 16%, CAMS is in crisis in every constituency, and the waiting lists are enormous, and the severity of what particularly young people are suffering now. And it's worth reminding people, I think it's still the case that the greatest cause of death amongst young men in particular is suicide. Yes. And any constituency MP will report that what's happened in their constituencies has been that decline of support, and as a result of that, the exacerbation of the tragedies that are taking place as well. Let's just move on to social care then. It's one of those issues that has been a hot political potato for a number of years. Again, the experience on the ground is a social care workforce where there's huge levels of vacancies, low pay, and, to be frank, exploitation of those people who are working within social care itself. Just take us through some of the numbers about the crisis at the moment, and then the sort of levels of investment that are needed to tackle those issues, particularly around recruitment, retention, and pay. Okay, so the social care workforce has never been in more crisis. Last year, there were 165,000 care worker vacancies. Just to halve that vacancy rate, not eradicate it, just to halve that rate would cost £1.7 billion in additional wages and recruitment. If you look at the consequences of that, Age UK says that there are 2.6 million people over 50 in England alone with unmet care needs that are basically being neglected. And we see that in terms of both the number of older people and disabled people that are going into A&E having falls through neglect, malnutrition and so on, things like that. But we also see it in delayed discharges at the other end of their treatment, where they're not able to be discharged into the community because the care packages just simply aren't there in a lot of parts of the country. So there is a real problem there. If you look at the workforce,
The care worker, care workers generally in England, there are a couple of exceptions where local councils have managed to fund a bit more, but overall, care workers in England are paid less than in Wales and in Scotland. Even if you just brought them up to that level, which is only another 50p an hour, you're talking about an extra 1.3 billion, and that will help with recruitment and retention, because a lot of people, a lot of care workers have looked at this over the last few years and seen they can make more working in retail or hospitality, and often with less unsociable hours without the overnight stays and all the rest of it.
Our care service relies upon a huge workforce out there which are unpaid carers. I chair a group of Labour supporters who are unpaid carers. We've set ourselves up as Labour's carers body. At the moment, most of them will say that their caring responsibilities are their priority, but actually, inevitably, it puts many of them into poverty. Why is that?
Well, there are two reasons for that. I mean, a number of people have had to give up work. The reason partly why economic inactivity, as it's called, has gone up is because of people having to care for elderly relatives and so on. To qualify for carers allowance, you have to be doing at least 30 plus hours a week, every week in, week out of care for a loved one. And for that 30 hours of work, you get the princely sum currently of about £76 a week, which is astonishingly low. And if you think about a comparative thing, if you're on maternity or paternity leave and you're entitled to statutory maternity or paternity allowance, you get £172 a week to care for a newborn. But if you're caring for a relative who's elderly or disabled, you get only £70 a week. So to bring it up just to that level, which seems to me a basic level of decency, would cost an extra 6.4 billion a year. Carers allowance has long been disgracefully low. It was one of the benefits that Barbara Castle linked to earnings actually increases in the 1970s, which Thatcher then removed in 1980 when she also broke the earnings link with pensions as well. So we really need to start bringing carers allowance back up, because it is a national disgrace. It has been for decades, to be frank.
One of the issues the carers have raised is if we get the benefit level up, and the benefit level, to be frank, doesn't really reflect the work that they put in, and actually the professional work they have to undertake because the complexity of the person's condition that they're dealing with, caring for. Their argument is actually the triple lock applied to pensions should be applied to benefits overall. So we don't have this falling behind anymore of benefits like this. Let's just move on to education. There's a lot in this report, and I just want to cover some of the key aspects of it. In terms of education and schools' budgets, we've looked at both what's happened since 2010. We've also looked at international comparators and where we stand there, particularly within the OECD. Take us through some of the figures there, Andrew.
Okay, I mean, there are different ways of looking at what's a normal level of education spending. We know throughout the 2010s, there was massive austerity in schools, even harsher on colleges and universities and the adult skills budget. And if you want a strong growing economy, you need to invest in skills training, in education. And it's vital that the next Labour government does that, especially since it's aiming to have the highest level of growth in the G7. So if you look at what education spending was as a percentage of GDP, say in 2010, at the end of the last Labour government, it was 5.4%. If you wanted to get back to that today, that would require an extra £20 billion of investment into education spending. Now, that's a massive, massive increase. But even if you thought, okay, well, that's not feasible straight away, or even by the end of Parliament, if you look at the OECD average, we are now below it, which again is quite damning of what the Conservatives have done. But it's also what's facing a Labour government, and we've got to be realistic about this. So to get back up to the OECD average will cost around 5 billion a year extra into education spending. And that's leaving aside, being the average of the OECD, which is the top 30, 35 or 39, countries in the world. It's not really that ambitious when we're the 6th biggest economy in the world. We really ought to be aiming a little higher than that. So I think that's a very modest target. People will say 20 billion is a lot and, is a very high target. So the truth, really what you need in order to achieve very high sustained growth is probably somewhere in between, but it's probably closer to the 20 billion mark.
Let's move on to one of my specific areas of interest, which is local government. My LGL, Greater London Council background, I was chair of finance in the early 80s. I think when we've looked at local government, I don't think even since the Second World War, maybe, we've never been in a situation where local government finance is so precarious. We've got councils after council now having Section 114 notices, which effectively mean they're bankrupt. They can't cover their outgoings from their income. So there's a crisis there that any government is going to have to deal with, but Labour in particular, because it's a lot of the policies it will want implemented will have to come at the grassroots level, and the leadership for that will have to come from local government and local councils. And in many ways, I feel for local Labour councillors in particular, the way that the burdens they're having to feel at the moment. Just take us through the percentage drop that we've seen in central government funding for local councils, because I think people will be shocked at that, and then also what that translates into pounds, shillings and pence.
Okay, well, there are two different ways of looking at this, John. So the National Audit Office did a report at the end of the last decade, it's sort of 2018, 2019, and they said there's been a 49% cut in central government funding going to local authorities. And people often don't realise this, but the majority of funding that goes to local councils doesn't come from our council tax, it comes from central government. Council tax is only, the minority of local government funding. So that's a huge cut in their funding, 49%. Now, what government has allowed councils to do is raise more money from different sources and have different funding pots. So the IFS looked at this, the Institute for Government looked for this, too many acronyms, and found that actually resource spending has gone down by 31%. So not quite as extreme as half, it's nearer a third cut in the overall budget. So that's funding's gone up a little bit in the last couple of years. The Tories have realised that there is such an acute crisis, but it isn't stopping councils going bust, as we've seen from Birmingham. And just last week, during Tory party conference, Hampshire Council, which is a county council run by the Tories, said we're in financial meltdown. Both they and Kent, another Tory county council, are on the brink of issuing Section 114 notices, and there are about a dozen or 2 dozen more councils around England that are on the brink of going bust. And that's because, in financial terms, there is £15 billion less in real terms going to local government from central government compared with 2010. And we've seen that. We've seen it in libraries being closed, social workers being laid off, swimming pools being closed, public toilets being closed, bus routes being cut outside of London, where obviously it's regulated and run differently. A whole range of services have been cut, closed, and people have lost that. So you're absolutely right, John. If Labour is expecting local government to start delivering more, and it needs to, then that funding has not just got to get back to 2010 levels. You've got to raise the capacity of local government to do more, because frankly, as I think anyone who's had to interact with local government services knows, through no fault of their own, they can barely run the services they're statutorily required to provide already. So that 15 billion is probably the most conservative estimate of what's needed to stabilise this, because the debt that these councils are running up, and you can look at my own council, Croydon, you can look at Woking, Slough, Thurrock, and all the others that have already gone as well, is a huge amount of money that those councils are never going to be able to pay off themselves. So some level of central government intervention is going to have to be required. And this is, the Tories kind of passed the buck austerity here. They passed these cuts on to local government and are then blaming them for going bankrupt. And unfortunately, it's going to fall to a Labour government to kind of fix this mess, which is an horrific mess of the of consecutive Conservative governments and local government secretaries.
In the report, I urge people to get a copy of the report, go online and read it through. There's a whole list of other areas, policy areas, where we're showing the huge challenge that Labour is going to face. On the Ministry of Justice, for example, just reverse it. They've had a 35% cut, and just reversing that is 3.8 billion a year. Two of the big areas, though, that Labour are going to have to deal with as soon as they get in is both tackling poverty and inequality, and then also with regard to public sector pay. In terms of poverty, this take us through just some of the rough numbers about what we know about the increase in poverty since 2010, and really the actions that a Labour government will need to implement fairly quickly if we're going to give people the hope of not living in poverty in the future.
Sure, John. I mean, these are DWP figures, so from the government themselves. Child poverty is now 600,000 higher than it was in 2010. It's gone up from 3.6 million to 4.2 million. And if you recall, unfortunately, in the last few years of the last Labour government, post-banking crash, child poverty started rising again. It had been cut by quite a significant amount in those first 10 years of the Labour government, but in the last 3, it started going back up. So 3.6 isn't a low figure to begin with, but it's gone up 600,000 since 2010. I mean, there's been a lot of debate around the 2-child benefit cap, which was a commitment in the last Labour manifesto. I think a commitment that had been made by Keir Starmer as leader as recently as sort of 2021, which now seems to be off the table. That would take 250,000 children out of poverty and would cost about 1.3 billion on the best estimate for that. So that doesn't even get you halfway back to where we were in 2010, and cost 1.3 billion. So I think people will get the sort of scale of intervention that's necessary in order to really start reducing child poverty in any significant way. And let's be clear, both parties, Conservatives and Labour, are committed to the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, which includes cutting child poverty. Or cutting poverty overall, reducing poverty by a half in the UK, which is a fall of about 5.9 million people at the moment. So there's a real high amount of investment, and we have the lowest social security in Western Europe. If you're unemployed in Ireland across the Irish Sea, you're getting more than nearly 3 times what you get here. In Germany and France, it's more than that. So we have poverty levels of benefits, deep poverty, growing levels of destitution as well at the extreme end, that really are going to have to be tackled. And there's no way around that. That needs more funding.
2/3 of the children living in poverty are in households where someone is at work. What does that say about pay? But public sector pay in particular has been virtually frozen under the Tories since they've been in power. What's needed on public sector pay, and what sort of level of expenditure are we talking about?
Yeah, I mean, public sector pay is worse than being frozen. It's actually less than it was in 2010 in real terms. The average public sector worker is earning £45 less a week in real terms, allowing for inflation, than in 2010. That's the equivalent of £2,340 a year less. Now, for experienced teachers, for example, those on slightly higher grades, the IFS has said they're £6,000 off £6,000 worse off in real terms than in 2010. So if you wanted to just put public sector workers back to 2010 levels, when they weren't getting a king's ransom, they weren't eating their dinners out off of gold plates, they were just getting decently paid, reasonably paid for the jobs they do, that would cost £13.6 billion just to take us back to 2010. That's a very, very modest level. And people may say, well, they can't do that overnight. But look, if you want to solve the crises in the NHS, in social care, in teaching, and all the other professions as well, but just take those 3, you have got to improve pay. Pay is a big part of it. It's not the totality of it, but it's a big part of it. So, the NHS has got over 110,000 vacancies. You've got to attract people into those professions and pay them well so they stay in those professions. Teachers, for example, the government only hit 59% of its recruitment target last year. You are not going to solve the teacher recruitment crisis unless you boost pay. So something has to be done. And it's interesting, in the National Policy Forum document that's going to Labour conference this week, it says, we will act to improve public service workers' living standards throughout the Parliament. Now that, to me, is a commitment to above inflation pay rises, because if it's not above inflation, then it's a real terms cut. And if you're improving their living standards, you are boosting them relative to the cost of living. That has to be done. Labour acknowledges that. It hasn't really set out yet how it's going to pay for it and on what scale. But there is no alternative to doing it. Otherwise, you will not fill the gaps. You will not clear the backlogs. You will not invest in people's education in a way that produces, investing in education is an investment in productivity and growth for the future. It really is a zero, a multiplier effect if you invest in education now. So it's really vital that we solve these crises of recruitment and low pay within the public sector, which helps boost it in the private sector as well.
In the report, we've also addressed what, to a certain extent, has become an obsessional interest with me with regard to capital spend, and also in terms of investment with regard to climate change. The issue there is tackling climate change, but also doing it in a way in which we grow our economy sustainably as well, and have all those, as you say, multiplier effects into the economy about how we can improve the levels of wages and at the same time receive a tax revenue income that will enable us to invest in public services in the future as well. Just on capital spend, our average now is, we're below average of the G7 and the OECD. Resolution Foundation saying if we'd have been at the OECD average, would have been 500 billion extra. Staggering, really, just shows how far behind we've set out in the report on climate change, just the rankings of where the government is in comparison with investment on solar power, wind power, etc., and what Labour will have to address. All of that's in the report, so I urge people to have a look at the in-tray report we've done. Let's just now grasp the nettle of how this, what's the level of investment that's needed in terms of day-to-day revenue expenditure if we're going to tackle, well, just some of these priorities. At the moment, what Labour has said is set out some of its tax proposals, which, for example, tackling non-dom status. All of these were proposals that we had in the last manifestos anyway. That brings in our calculation, that brings in about 5 billion, additional 5 billion pounds a year in tax revenues from what Labour has said so far. The Shadow Chancellor has said we will grow the economy, and that will enable us to fund our policies in the future. We've looked at what happens on growth, what's happened over the last couple of decades, what's the reality of when growth, what sort of levels of growth you can achieve, and the timescale on all of that. Just take us through some of those figures, Andrew, because we need to get real on this, don't we?
Yeah, brace yourselves, really. So we've not covered every policy area in this document. So, for example, there are some areas where, say on the police, numbers are back up to where they were in 2010. So we didn't look at that. But you could argue, as Labour has, I think, that we need more PCSOs, more community police. We didn't look at childcare because we've got a big investment that the Chancellor announced coming on stream in the next financial year. And Labour has said it will work within that envelope. So I just want to talk people through our methodology a little bit here, just briefly. And on things like, getting rid of student fees, which you and I both agree on, and I suspect a lot of Labour members watching this video will agree on. We haven't put that in there because that's not Labour policy. They've ruled that out. So this is just the core spending on the biggest areas of public spending. I think a conservative estimate of what is needed just to stabilise, in some cases to get us back to 2010 levels, just that would be about an extra £70 billion a year. That's before you do any extra policies, any extra good things, provide extra services. That's the level we're at. And, you're right to talk about growth. Growth is vitally important, and we need to increase the level of growth. Our economy's grown at just over 1% in the 15 years, 1% per year, in the 15 years since the banking crash. Now, let's go back to the 70s, which is often maligned as a decade of chaos and strikes and all the rest of it. Growth averaged 3% in the 1970s. So that's how dire it is. We're in a very bad state. But if you increase GDP growth by 1% a year, which would be quite a big uplift from where we have been, stagnating along the bottom for a long time, that only brings in probably, the IFS say about 12.5, 13 billion a year. That's not big money. It is big money. It's obviously a large amount, but in terms of the scale of what we're going to face in terms of public service underfunding, that's not going to be it. And of course, we're not going to get there in year one because we're going to obviously build up to the 28 billion. We're not going to put that massive investment, and investment is the precursor to growth often. So we have got to look at tax changes, and the more tax changes that are ruled out, whether that's on income tax or corporation tax or a wealth tax or equalising capital gains, the more we're limiting ourselves on what we're going to be able to do. So the real plea, I think, is look at the crises that are out there in our public services, look at the underfunding, the understaffing, the backlogs, and we've got to get real about how we're going to tackle that. And that does mean, redistributive taxation, I think, as well as growth, which is, again, is going to have to make the case, I think, for more borrowing to invest.
The reality is, just on some of the priorities we've set out in this document about Labour's in-tray, increase of revenue expenditure, day-to-day expenditure of about 70 billion. At the moment, Labour has put forward proposals for 5 billion, but committed that expenditure elsewhere. And even if we secure growth rapidly of 1%, which is a tough challenge, only maybe 13 billion at best. So there's a huge gap there that can only be tackled by redistribution of wealth in this country. So that's the challenge for Labour. That's the nettle it has to grasp. Andrew, thank you for this. People can gain a copy of the report online, and we'd welcome people's comments as part of the debate as we look forward and work hard for a Labour government, getting rid of these Tories, but also making sure that we have a Labour government that addresses the problems our community faces.